The wind came down from the mountains like a starved wolf, all teeth and howl, carrying with it the taste of alkali dust and dead dreams. It was the autumn of 1880, and the town of Dust Creek lay sprawled beneath the vast Wyoming sky like a carcass picked clean by vultures. The gold rush had come and gone, leaving behind empty mine shafts and emptier promises, and what remained was a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support, as if the next strong gust might blow them all to kingdom come. Jack Brennan rode into town on a horse that looked about as used up as he felt. The animal's ribs showed through its dusty coat, and its head hung low, matching the slouch of its rider. Jack's clothes told the story of too many miles and not enough rest leather chaps cracked with age, a coat that had once been brown but was now the color of trail dust, and boots held together more by stubbornness than stitching. The silver conchos on his gun belt, once the mark of a successful bounty hunter, were tarnished black. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors of work that turned out to be as substantial as smoke. Now, with less than $5 to his name and a horse that needed grain worse than he needed whiskey, Jack found himself in yet another dying town at the edge of nowhere. The main street of Dust Creek was wider than it needed to be, built back when men thought this place might become something. Now, tumbleweeds had more right to it than wagons. Jack counted maybe 24 souls moving about their business, most of them with that particular shuffle of folks who'd given up hoping for better but hadn't quite worked up the gumption to move on. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside what passed for a saloon. The last dollar, according to the faded sign that creaked on rusty chains. The irony wasn't lost on him. Inside, he could hear voices raised in argument, but that was nothing new. Men argued in saloons like birds sang at dawn. It was just what they did. Jack was about to push through the batwing doors when something caught his attention. A crowd was gathering down the street, near the old auction block that most towns used for selling livestock and seized property. But there was something different about this gathering, an ugly energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "What's all the commotion?" Jack asked a grizzled prospector who was hurrying past. The old man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Henley's calling in his markers. Got himself a special auction today." The way he said special made Jack's jaw tighten. That widow Morrison couldn't pay what her dead husband owed, so Henley's got the judge to let him sell her contract. Contract? Jack's voice was flat, but something cold was building in his chest. Indenture, they're calling it, but we all know what it really is. The prospector shook his head. "Ain't been nothing like this since before the war. Thought we was done with such business." Jack had thought so too. He'd fought in that war, seen men die for the principle that human beings weren't property. The cold feeling in his chest was turning hot. He followed the crowd, his spurs making soft chinking sounds against the wooden boardwalk. The auction block came into view, and there she was, a woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Standing with her chin raised despite the circumstances. She wore a simple black dress, mourning clothes that had seen better days, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun. But it was her eyes that caught him, gray as a winter storm, and just as fierce, even as tears tracked down her cheeks. Silas Henley stood beside her, a man who looked like a vulture dressed in a banker's suit. His thin lips were pulled back in what might have been a smile on a human face. "Gentlemen," he called out, "as you know, the late Mr. Morrison owed me considerable money. His widow here," he gestured at her like she was a prize heifer, "has no means to repay. The judge has therefore granted me the right to sell her labor contract to recover my losses." "This ain't right. Henley!" someone shouted from the crowd. "It's legal," Henley shot back. "Judge Pritchard signed the papers himself. 7 years of service to clear the debt. Now, who'll start the bidding at $50? Jack felt his hand move toward his pocket, where his last few coins rested. It was insane. He barely had enough to feed himself and his horse for another week. But the memory of another woman, another time, another failure, crashed over him like a flash flood. He'd stood by once before when he should have acted. The weight of that had been riding with him longer than any bounty he'd ever chased. 75, called out a voice. Jack turned to see a thick-set man with the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal, the kind who probably ran a sporting house and was always looking for new employees. 100. This from a rancher Jack recognized as Tom Bassett, who had a reputation for working his hands into the ground. The widow, Morrison. The prospector had said stood perfectly still, but Jack could see her hands trembling where they were clasped in front of her. The crowd was getting louder, some men shouting bids, others protesting the whole shameful business. 150, 200. The numbers climbed, and with each new bid, something died a little more in the woman's eyes. Jack had seen that look before, in the faces of Apache warriors forced onto reservations, in the eyes of soldiers who'd lost too many friends. It was the look of someone watching their last hope disappear like water in the desert. His hand closed around the coins in his pocket. $4.37. It might as well have been 4 cents for all the good it would do. But then his fingers found something else, the gold watch his father had given him. The one thing of value he'd held on to through all the lean years. It had to be worth something. 250 going once, Henley was saying, his voice oily with satisfaction. Jack pushed through the crowd. 300, he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Every head turned. Henley's eyes narrowed as he took in Jack's trail-worn appearance. You have $300. Stranger. Jack pulled out the watch, letting it catch the sunlight. This ought to cover it. Pure gold. Swiss movement. He tossed his coins onto the platform with a clatter. And $4.37. A murmur ran through the crowd. The sporting house owner looked like he wanted to bid again, but Henley held up a hand. He was a businessman above all else, and he knew gold when he saw it. Well now, Henley said, examining the watch. Appears we have a winner. $300 from... He paused, waiting. Brennan, Jack supplied. Jack Brennan. Mr. Brennan here has just purchased Mrs. Morrison's contract. The way he said it made Jack want to put his fist through the man's face. Congratulations on your new employee. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others muttering about the state of the world. A few looked at Jack with something like respect, but most seemed to be wondering what a saddle tramp wanted with a widow. Jack climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, he could see the widow was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 22 or 3. Her gray eyes met his with a mixture of wariness and defiance. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Reckon we should get you away from here. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions in his weathered face. Finally, she gave a small nod. I suppose I belong to you now, Mr. Brennan. No, ma'am, Jack said quietly, so only she could hear. You don't belong to anybody but yourself. Never did, never will. Her eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her composure. Before she could respond, Henley interrupted, holding out a paper. You'll need to sign this. Brennan makes it all legal-like. Jack took the pen and scrawled his name, the irony bitter in his mouth. He'd just spent his last coins to participate in something that went against everything he believed in. But sometimes, he reckoned, you had to walk through hell to get to the other side. As he helped Mrs. Morrison down from the platform, feeling the tremor in her hand as she took his arm, Jack caught sight of his reflection in a store window. He looked like what he was, a used-up bounty hunter with nothing to his name but a tired horse and a duty he'd just taken on with money he didn't have. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. He'd spent his last coins to save the widow from the auction. What came next? He didn't know. But as they walked away from that cursed platform, the wind shifted, and for just a moment, it carried the scent of rain on the distant mountains, a promise that even in this desolate place, things could change. The moment they stepped away from the auction block, The whispers started. Jack could feel eyes boring into his back like hot needles. Could hear the ugly speculation spreading through the crowd like wildfire in dry grass. Bounty hunter's got himself a woman. Someone snickered. Poor thing, out of the frying pan and into the fire, a woman's voice added, dripping with false sympathy. Mrs. Morrison. He realized he didn't even know her first name. Walked beside him with her head high, but he could feel the slight tremor running through her where her hand rested on his arm. It was a touch born of necessity, not trust, and he understood that clear enough. Brennan! The voice cracked like a whip. Jack turned to see Tom Bassett shouldering through the crowd, his face red with drink and indignation. What's a broke-down bounty hunter want with a respectable widow? You ain't got 2 nickels to rub together. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. Violence wouldn't help her situation. That's between the lady and me, he said evenly. Lady? Bassett spat in the dust. She's bound property now. Your property? We all know what that means. The widow's fingers tightened on Jack's arm, her nails digging in through the worn fabric of his coat. He could feel her wanting to speak, to defend herself, but knowing that anything she said would only make it worse. Only thing I know, Jack said, his voice dropping low and dangerous, is that you're blocking our way. Bassett's hand hovered near his pistol, but something in Jack's eyes made him think better of it. Jack had spent years hunting the worst men the frontier had to offer. That kind of work left marks on a man that others could read like sign. This ain't over, Bassett muttered, but he stepped aside. As they moved down the street, the crowd parted before them like they were carrying disease. Women pulled their skirts aside and men turned their backs. The message was clear. By participating in the auction, both of them had crossed a line that respectable folk wouldn't forgive. The sky was already starting to bruise purple in the east, and Jack realized with a sinking feeling that he hadn't thought past getting her away from that platform. He had no money for a hotel room, and taking her to the saloon would only confirm everyone's worst assumptions. Mr. Brennan. She spoke for the first time since leaving the platform, her voice steady despite everything. I need to collect my things. What little there is. Where? The boarding house on 2nd Street. Mrs. Claiborne gave me 2 days to vacate after... She paused, swallowing hard. After the judge made his ruling. They turned onto 2nd Street just as the first drops of rain began to fall. It wasn't the clean rain of spring, but the dirty, ash-gray rain that came at the end of autumn, mixing with the dust to create a thin mud that clung to everything. Mrs. Claiborne was waiting on the porch of her boarding house, arms crossed over her ample bosom like a fortress gate. Sarah Morrison, she called out, using the widow's first name like a weapon. You're no longer welcome here. I've come for my belonging, Sarah said quietly. They're on the back step. Didn't want them contaminating my clean rooms. The landlady's eyes shifted to Jack. And you, Jack Brennan, I remember when you brought in the Garrison boys. Thought you were some kind of hero then. Look at you now, buying women like cattle. Jack felt Sarah flinch beside him, but he kept his voice level. Just get her things. Ma'am, we'll be on our way. They found the trunk on the back steps, already soaked through from the rain. It was pathetically small, probably containing everything she owned in the world. Jack hefted it onto his shoulder, the weight negligible compared to the burden he'd just taken on. Where are we going? Sarah asked as they trudged back through the increasingly heavy rain. It was a fair question, and one he didn't have a good answer to. Then he remembered the old miner's shack on the edge of town, abandoned since its owner died of lung fever the previous winter. It wasn't much, but it would keep the rain off. There's a place, he said. It ain't fancy, but it's shelter. The shack sat a half-mile outside town proper, backed up against a cluster of cottonwoods that provided some protection from the wind. The door hung on one hinge, and the windows were covered with oiled paper instead of glass. But the roof looked solid enough. Jack pushed the door open and set the trunk down inside. The place smelled of dust and old smoke, but it was dry. A few pieces of furniture remained, a table with one broken leg propped up with stones, 2 chairs that looked like they might hold weight, and a narrow cot in the corner. Sarah stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her black dress, creating puddles around her worn boots. In the fading light, she looked younger and more vulnerable than she had on the auction block, but her eyes still held that storm-gray defiance. "Thank you," she said finally, the words seeming to cost her something. "For what you did, though I don't understand why." Jack found some old newspapers and kindling by the pot-bellied stove. His matches were damp, but after several tries, he got a small flame going. Seemed like the right thing to do. The right thing. A bitter laugh escaped her. "You spent everything you had to buy a woman's labor contract. That doesn't seem particularly smart, Mr. Brennan." "Nobody ever accused me of being smart," Jack said, feeding larger pieces of wood into the stove. The fire caught properly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah moved closer to the warmth, her arms wrapped around herself. "What do you expect from me?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Jack could feel her fear beneath the brave front, could see it in the way she positioned herself near the door, ready to run if needed. "Nothing," he said simply. "I expect nothing. Men don't spend their last dollar for nothing." "Maybe not." Jack sat heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly feeling every one of his 40 years. "But I ain't most men." She studied him in the firelight, taking in the lines etched by sun and wind, the scarred hands, the way he kept his gun side clear even sitting down. "You're a bounty hunter." Haven't taken a bounty in near 6 months. He pulled off his wet hat, running fingers through hair that had gone gray at the temples. "Turns out I lost the stomach for it." "What changed?" Jack stared into the fire, seeing faces in the flames. "Brought in a man once. Young fellow, not much more than a kid. Had a bounty on him for horse theft. Turned out he'd taken the horse to get medicine to his sick wife. By the time I brought him in and collected my $30, she was dead." He shook his head. After that, the money didn't seem worth it anymore. Sarah sank into the other chair, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I'm sorry. Weren't your fault." Jack pulled out his tobacco pouch, then remembered he'd used the last of it 2 days ago. "What about you? How'd you end up in this mess?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "My husband, Daniel, he had dreams. Heard there was silver in the hills. Decided we'd make our fortune. We sold everything. Came out here with such hope." Her voice caught. "The mine played out in 3 months, but Daniel kept borrowing, kept believing the next blast would hit the vein. Silas Henley was happy to loan him money at 20% interest. And then, cave in. They brought him home on a board." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "That was 2 months ago. Henley gave me a week to mourn before he came calling." Outside, the rain had turned into a proper downpour, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Lightning flashed, illuminating the shabby interior of the shack for a moment before plunging them back into the orange glow of the fire. "You must be hungry," Jack said, then remembered he had nothing to offer. His saddlebags held some jerky that was more leather than meat, and a handful of coffee beans he'd been saving. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though he could see the lie in it. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain and the pop of the fire. In the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and wild. The sound seemed to emphasize their isolation. 2 strangers thrown together by desperate circumstances. "I should look at your trunk," Sarah said suddenly. "Make sure nothing's ruined from the rain." She knelt beside the small trunk, opening it carefully. Jack tried not to watch, to give her some privacy, but he could see the meager contents. A few dresses, some undergarments that she quickly covered, a Bible with worn edges, and something wrapped in blue cloth that she held for a moment before setting aside. "My mother's cameo," she explained, though he hadn't asked. "The only thing of value I have left. I tried to sell it to pay Henley, but he said it wasn't worth enough." Probably lying. Man like that would squeeze blood from a stone and complain it wasn't enough. Sarah almost smiled at that, the first break in her rigid composure. "You don't like him much." "I don't like any man who profits from misery." Jack stood, stretching muscles cramped from the long ride. "It's getting late. You should take the cot." "Where will you sleep?" "I've got my bedroll. I'll be fine by the stove." She looked like she wanted to protest, but exhaustion was winning over politeness. "Mr. Brennan, what happens tomorrow?" It was another question he didn't have an answer for. Come morning, he'd have to figure out how to feed them both with no money and a horse that needed grain. He'd have to deal with Henley and that damned contract. He'd have to face a town that would be even more hostile in the cold light of day. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "One day at a time." Sarah nodded, accepting this non-answer because what else could she do? She took one of the dresses from her trunk and hung it near the stove to dry, then retreated to the cot in the corner, pulling a thin blanket over herself. Jack spread his bedroll on the floor, his Colt within easy reach. The rain was easing now, settling into a steady patter that might last all night. Through the oiled paper window, he could see the faint lights of Dust Creek in the distance, looking like stars that had fallen to earth and were slowly dying. He thought about the watch he'd given up, his father's last gift, traded for a woman's freedom. Except she wasn't free, was she? That piece of paper Henley had made him sign said she owed him 7 years of labor. 7 years. A man could grow old in 7 years. A woman could lose all hope. In the corner, he could hear Sarah's breathing even out as exhaustion finally claimed her. But every now and then, she'd make a small sound, like a wounded animal, and he knew she was crying in her sleep. Jack stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the wind and the distant howl of wolves. He'd spent his last coins to save a widow from the auction, but salvation was a funny thing. Sometimes it looked an awful lot like damnation, and only time would tell which one he'd purchased today. The fire had burned down to embers when Sarah's voice broke through the darkness. "Are you awake?" Jack had been dozing fitfully, one part of his mind always alert for trouble. "I am now. I can't sleep." He heard her shift on the cot. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Daniel's face when they brought him out of that mine." Jack fed another piece of wood to the stove, coaxing the flames back to life. The renewed light showed Sarah sitting up, the blanket pulled around her shoulders like armor. Her hair had come loose from its severe bun, falling in dark waves around her face. "How long were you married?" he asked. 3 years. We met in Independence. I was working in my uncle's dry goods store, and Daniel came in looking for supplies. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. He couldn't afford half of what he wanted, but he had such grand dreams. Talked about the fortunes waiting in the Western Territories, about building something lasting. Dreams have a way of leading folks astray out here. "Did you ever have dreams, Mr. Brennan?" Jack considered the question. Once, had a little spread down in Texas before the war. Wife named Mary, couple of kids. The words came hard, pulled from a place he usually kept locked tight. "Comanches hit while I was away getting supplies. By the time I got back..." He didn't finish, didn't need to. "I'm sorry. Was a long time ago. 20 years. But who was counting? After that, I joined up with the Union. Figured I'd die in the war and that would be that. But I didn't die. Just came out the other side different." "Is that when you became a bounty hunter?" "Seemed like the only thing I was good for. Tracking, hunting, bringing men to justice." He laughed, bitter as alkali water. "Justice. Like there's any such thing." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Sarah asked, "What happened to the man you brought in? The horse thief?" "Hanged. Judge gave him the rope for stealing a $30 horse." Jack's hands clenched into fists. His wife was 16 years old and dead of fever because he couldn't get her medicine in time. That's justice for you. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter. Daniel wasn't a bad man, just foolish. He believed every story about silver strikes, every rumor of fortunes made overnight. And Henley was there with his smooth words and easy credit. Men like Henley are vultures. They circle dying dreams and pick the bones clean. The worst part is, I warned Daniel, begged him to be careful, to stop borrowing. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The morning he died, we argued. I told him I was done, that I couldn't watch him throw our lives away anymore. Those were the last words I said to him. Jack understood that particular weight. We all got things we wish we could take back.
Do you think he forgives me?
I think dead men don't hold grudges. It's the living that can't forgive themselves. Sarah wiped at her eyes. You're not what I expected from a bounty hunter. What did you expect? Someone harder, meaner, more like... She paused. More like the men who were bidding on me. I've been hard and mean plenty. It didn't bring nobody back. Jack stretched out on his bedroll again. You should try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to come whether we're ready or not. But Sarah wasn't done talking. Maybe it was the darkness, or the isolation, or just the need to speak to someone who didn't judge her for her circumstances. Henley came to me the day after the funeral, said Daniel owed him nearly $800 with interest. Might as well have been $8,000 for all the chance I had of paying it. $800. And he was selling your contract for $3? He said the rest would be made up through my service. 7 years at a value of $75 per year, plus the $300 from the auction. Her voice turned hard. He had it all figured out, neat as arithmetic. Jack felt anger rise hot in his chest. Bastard was making a profit on misery. The judge agreed with him. Said it was all legal, that I'd signed as co-guarantor on the loans. Sarah's laugh was bitter. I signed because Daniel asked me to, because I trusted my husband. Look where trust got me. Trust ain't the enemy. It's the people who abuse it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then asked, What are you going to do with me, Mr. Brennan? I told you. Nothing. That paper says I owe you 7 years of labor. Paper says a lot of things. Doesn't make them right. Jack sat up, meeting her eyes across the dim space. Far as I'm concerned, that contract ain't worth the ink it's written with. You're free to go whenever you want. Go where? With what? Sarah's voice cracked. I have nothing, no money, no family here, no way to get back east. And even if I could leave, Henley would just have me dragged back. That contract is legal in the eyes of the law. She was right, and they both knew it. Jack had acted on instinct, on anger and old guilt, but he hadn't thought through the consequences. Now they were both trapped by that piece of paper. Then we figure out how to get you clear of it legal-like, he said. There's gotta be a way. With what money? You spent everything you had. I'll find work. There's always someone needs something done. Not for a man who just bought a woman at auction. You saw how they looked at us. We're pariahs now. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, something rustled in the cottonwoods. Probably just a raccoon. But Jack's hand moved to his gun anyway. Old habits. I've been an outcast before, he said. Ain't nothing new. I haven't... Sarah's voice was small. I've always been respectable, even when we were poor. I had my dignity. Now... She didn't finish, but the weight of her loss hung in the air. Dignity ain't something other people can take from you. Only you can give that away. Easy words from a man. Fair enough. Jack couldn't argue with that. The world was harder on women who stepped outside the lines society drew for them. They talked on as the night wore down, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. Sarah told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents' farm and the brother who'd died in the war. Jack found himself talking about things he'd kept buried. The loneliness of the trail, the faces of men he'd brought in, the weight of violence that never quite washed clean. I've killed 14 men in my life, he said at one point, not sure why he was confessing this. Every one of them was trying to kill me, but that doesn't make them any less dead. Does it haunt you? Everything haunts me. The simple truth of it surprised him. Just a matter of learning to live with ghosts. As dawn approached, painting the oiled paper windows a pale gray, exhaustion finally overtook conversation. Sarah lay back down, and Jack could hear her breathing deepen into real sleep. He stayed awake, watching the light grow stronger, thinking about the mess he'd gotten them both into. He'd saved her from the auction. But what now? He had no money, no prospects, and a horse that would need feeding soon. They couldn't stay in this shack forever. But going back to town meant facing the ugliness of what they'd become in everyone's eyes. The contract was the real problem, as long as that piece of paper existed. Sarah wasn't truly free. Henley would use it to make their lives miserable, maybe even send men after them if they tried to leave. And there was something else, something in the banker's eyes that suggested he hadn't given up on collecting what he felt he was owed. Jack must have dozed off, because he woke to the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving with purpose. He was on his feet with his Colt in hand before fully awake, moving to the window. 4 riders were coming up the trail, and even in the early morning light, he could see they weren't friendly visitors. The lead rider was Big Tom Garrison, brother to one of the men Jack had brought in years ago, the kind of man who held grudges like treasures. "Sarah," Jack said quietly, but urgent. "We've got company." She sat up, instantly alert. The peaceful moment was over. The real world, with all its ugliness and violence, had found them. Jack checked his gun. 5 shots. No extra ammunition. Not great odds against 4 men. "Friends of yours?" Sarah asked, moving to peer out the window. "Not exactly." Jack was already calculating angles, distances, cover. "Looks like word's gotten out about yesterday. Henley must have put a bounty on getting you back. But you have the contract. Men like that don't care much about paperwork when there's money involved." Jack moved to the door. "Stay inside. Stay down. Whatever happens, don't come out." Sarah grabbed his arm. "What are you going to do?" "What I'm good at," Jack said grimly. "Surviving." He stepped out onto the porch just as the riders pulled up, spreading out in a half circle. The morning sun was at their backs, putting Jack at a disadvantage, but he'd faced worse odds. "Morning, Garrison," Jack called out, his hand resting easy on his gun butt. "Little early for a social call." Big Tom smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Heard you got yourself in the woman-buying business. Brennan, funny thing for a man with no money. Man does what he has to. Well, mister, Henley figures you can't provide proper care for your property. He's willing to buy that contract back, even give you a little profit for your trouble. That's mighty generous, but I'll have to decline." Garrison's smile faded. "Don't reckon you understood me. That wasn't exactly a request." Jack could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. 4 against 1, and they had him pinned against the shack. But he'd learned long ago that violence was as much about will as skill, and these men were used to easier prey. "I understood fine," Jack said. "Answer's still no. Now, you boys best move along before someone gets hurt. Only one getting hurt here is you, bounty man." Garrison's hand moved toward his gun. "Unless you want to be reasonable." Jack saw it then, movement in the cottonwoods behind the riders. For a moment he thought he was seeing things, then recognized the distinctive shape of a rifle barrel catching the morning light. Someone else was out there, someone the riders hadn't noticed. "Reasonable," Jack said slowly, buying time. "That's a funny word coming from a man who's about to draw on someone holding legal papers. Legal don't mean much out here, and you know it." That was when Sarah stepped out of the shack, Daniel's old shotgun in her hands. Jack hadn't even known she had it. "Legal means something to me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "And I'll thank you to get off our property." The riders shifted uneasily. A woman with a shotgun was an unknown quantity, and the twin barrels looked mighty large in the morning light. "Now, ma'am," Garrison started, but Sarah cut him off. "Don't you ma'am me. I know what Henley sent you for, and you can tell him he's not getting it. I've been bought and sold once. It won't happen again." The moment stretched taut. Jack could see Garrison calculating odds, wondering if the widow really knew how to use that scattergun, wondering if the profit was worth the risk. Then a voice called from the cottonwoods, "You boys lost?" Everyone turned to see a grizzled black man step out of the trees, a Henry rifle cradled casual-like in his arms. Jack recognized him. Moses Washington, former Buffalo soldier, now scratching out a living as a hunter and guide. "This ain't your concern." "Moses," Garrison said. But some of the confidence had leaked out of his voice. Maybe not. Moses agreed amiably. But I was tracking a deer and couldn't help but notice 4 armed men surrounding folks who ain't done nothing wrong. Made me curious. The odds had shifted. Jack saw Garrison realize it too. The big man's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "This ain't over, Brennan," he finally said. "Henley's got legal claim to that woman, contract or no contract. You can't watch her every minute." "I can try," Jack replied evenly. Garrison wheeled his horse around, his men following. They rode off in a cloud of dust, but Jack knew they'd be back. Men like that always came back. Moses walked up to the shack, nodding to Jack and touching his hat brim to Sarah. "Mrs. Morrison. Heard about yesterday. Shameful business." "Thank you for your help," Sarah said, lowering the shotgun with visibly shaking hands. "Wasn't nothing. Been meaning to pay Jack a visit anyway." Moses turned to Jack. "Got a proposition for you, if you're interested." "What kind of proposition?" "Wolves been taking cattle up in the Bighorn Valley. Ranchers pooling money for someone to thin them out. Dangerous work, but it pays. Figured a man of your skills might be interested." Jack glanced at Sarah. Money for dangerous work. It was always the way, but they needed funds if they were going to fight Henley legally. "How much?" $20 a wolf. I counted at least a dozen in the pack." It was good money. Very good. But it meant leaving Sarah alone. And Garrison had made it clear they'd be watching for that opportunity. "I'll think on it," Jack said. Moses nodded. "You do that. I'll be at Murphy's trading post if you decide." He started to leave, then turned back. "Oh, and Brennan? That paper Henley's waving around might be legal, but there's legal and there's right. Most folks around here can still tell the difference, even if some can't." After Moses left, Jack and Sarah stood in the morning sun, the shotgun still in her hands. The brief moment of victory was already fading, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. "They'll be back," Sarah said. "Yes, and we can't stay here forever." "No." She looked at him, gray eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Jack thought about Mary and the children, about all the men he'd tracked down for money, about the young horse thief swinging from a rope. "Maybe I'm trying to balance the scales a little. That's a heavy burden for one man. Been carrying heavy burdens a long time. One more won't break me." Sarah handed him the shotgun. "It wasn't loaded. I don't even have shells for it." Despite everything, Jack found himself almost smiling. "You've got sand, Mrs. Morrison. I'll give you that." "Sarah," she said, "if we're going to be outcast together, you might as well call me Sarah." The sun was fully up now, warming the desert air. In the distance, Dust Creek was waking up to a new day. Soon enough, they'd have to face what that day would bring. Henley's machinations, the town's judgment, the long struggle for true freedom. But for now, they stood together in the morning light, 2 damaged souls who'd found an unexpected alliance in each other. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Jack reflected, a start was all you needed to change the ending of a story. They left the shack before the sun reached its zenith, Jack's horse carrying what little they owned. Sarah walked beside him, refusing his offers to ride, saying she'd rather stretch her legs after being cooped up. Truth was, Jack suspected, she knew the old gelding couldn't carry them both far. The land stretched out before them like a rumpled brown blanket, dotted with sage and rabbit brush. To the north, the mountains rose blue and distant, their peaks already wearing caps of early snow. The trail they followed was little more than a deer track, winding between red rock formations that looked like ancient ruins. "Where are we headed?" Sarah asked, shading her eyes against the glare. Moses mentioned a family of settlers about 15 miles north. Quakers. Name of Patterson. They might put us up for a night or two while I figure out this wolf hunting business. You're really considering it? Don't see much choice. We need money if we're going to fight Henley legal-like. They walked in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves on hard-packed earth. Jack found himself stealing glances at Sarah, noting how she moved with surprising grace, despite her worn boots and the rough terrain. There was steel in her spine that her tears the night before hadn't revealed. By midday, the sun was a hammer beating down on them. They stopped in the shade of a massive cottonwood beside what might generously be called a creek, really just a trickle of water over rocks. Jack's canteen was near empty, and they'd had nothing to eat since yesterday. "Drink," he said, handing her the canteen. "Dehydration will kill you faster than hunger out here." Sarah took a small sip, then tried to hand it back. "You need it too. I've gone without before." But his throat was dust dry, and when she insisted, he took a careful swallow. They refilled the canteen from the creek, Jack showing Sarah how to dig a small depression beside the flow to let the sediment settle. "Clean water's more precious than gold out here," he explained. "Many a man's died with his pockets full of ore because he didn't respect the desert." As they rested, a dust plume appeared on their back trail. Jack was on his feet immediately, hand on his gun. But it was just a single rider moving at an easy pace. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the distinctive hat and coat of a traveling preacher. "Afternoon, friends," the rider called out, raising a hand in greeting. He was a thin man with gentle eyes and hands that had never known hard labor. "Name's Reverend Josiah Mills. Mind if I share your shade for a spell?" Jack relaxed slightly but kept watchful. In his experience, men who claimed to speak for God were as likely to be charlatans as saints. "Help yourself, Reverend." The preacher dismounted, producing a cloth bag from his saddlebags. "I've got some biscuits and dried apples, if you're hungry. The Lord provides, and He expects us to share His provisions." Jack's pride warred with his empty stomach, but Sarah had no such qualms. "Thank you kindly, Reverend. We're much obliged." As they ate, the biscuits were hard as rocks but filling. The Reverend studied them with knowing eyes. "I heard about the auction yesterday. Shameful business. News travels fast," Jack said neutrally. "Indeed it does, especially when it concerns injustice." The Reverend took a swig from his own canteen. "I tried to speak against it, but Judge Pritchard wouldn't hear of interference, said it was all legal and proper." "Legal and proper," Sarah repeated bitterly, as if those words could make slavery righteous again. "The law and righteousness parted ways many times in Scripture," Reverend Mills said gently. "But I sense you folks are trying to walk a righteous path despite the law's failings." Jack wasn't sure about righteous, but he appreciated the lack of judgment in the preacher's voice. "We're just trying to survive, Reverend. And sometimes that's the most righteous path of all." Mills reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. "I can't undo what's been done, but perhaps this will help." Jack started to refuse, but the Reverend held up a hand. "Pride goeth before a fall. Mr. Brennan, besides, it's not charity. It's justice. This money was meant for the church building fund, but I reckon the Lord would rather see it used to help folks in immediate need." The pouch held maybe $10 in mixed coins. Not a fortune, but enough to buy supplies. Jack felt his throat tighten. "I'll pay you back. Pay it forward instead," Mills said, mounting his horse. "And if you're headed north, be careful. I heard talk of Apache raiding parties pushing down from the mountains. The army's been stretched thin, and the tribes are taking advantage." After the Reverend rode off, they continued their journey. Bellies no longer empty, but hearts heavier with the knowledge of new dangers. The trail began to climb, winding between rust-colored mesas and through narrow canyons where the walls trapped heat like an oven. Late afternoon brought them to a wider valley where a creek ran clear and cold from the mountains. They could see the Patterson homestead in the distance, a neat cabin with a barn and corral, smoke rising from the chimney. As they approached, a woman emerged from the cabin, shading her eyes with her hand. "Travelers coming," she called back into the cabin, and soon a man joined her, a rifle held casually but ready. "Afternoon," Jack called out when they were within polite hailing distance. We're looking for the Patterson family. Moses Washington said you might have room for travelers." The man lowered his rifle slightly. "Any friend of Moses is welcome here. I'm Jacob Patterson. This is my wife, Ruth." Ruth Patterson was a small, neat woman with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes. She took one look at Sarah's dust-covered dress and tired face and immediately took charge.
You poor dear, you must be exhausted. Come inside. Jacob, see to Mr.
Brennan, Jack Brennan. See to Mr. Brennan's horse, and don't stand there gossiping when there's work to be done." Despite her brusque words, there was warmth in Ruth's voice. And soon, Sarah was whisked inside, while Jack helped Jacob tend to his horse. The barn was well built and clean, speaking of people who took pride in their work. "Moses sent word you might be coming," Jacob said as they rubbed down the gelding. "Said you'd had some trouble in Dust Creek." "You could say that." Jacob nodded, not pressing for details. "We don't hold with that auction business. Goes against everything we believe. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. We're grateful, but I can work for our keep. Don't want to be a burden. No burden in helping folks in need. But if it makes you feel better, there's always work on a homestead." Inside the cabin, Jack found Sarah already helping Ruth with dinner preparations. She'd washed the trail dust from her face and hands, and there was color in her cheeks again. The Patterson children, 3 boys ranging from maybe 6 to 12, watched the visitors with curious eyes. Dinner was simple but plentiful: venison stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches for dessert. The Pattersons didn't ask questions about the auction or their circumstances, instead filling the meal with gentle conversation about the homestead and the challenges of frontier life. "The Apache have been more active lately," Jacob said, echoing the Reverend's warning. "Lost 2 cattle last month, though whether to Indians or wolves, we couldn't say." "Speaking of wolves," Ruth added, "that bounty Moses mentioned is good money, but dangerous work. The pack's been smart about avoiding hunters." After dinner, the women cleared while Jack joined Jacob on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. In the distance, a coyote yipped, answered by another. "Your woman seems like good people," Jacob said, packing a pipe. "She's not my woman," Jack corrected. "Just someone who needed help." Jacob gave him a long look. "If you say so, but I've seen how you watch each other when you think the other's not looking." Jack didn't have an answer for that. Truth was, he had been watching Sarah, noticing things, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the slight furrow between her brows when she was worried, the way her rare smiles transformed her face. "I was married once," Jack found himself saying, "long time ago." "What happened?" "Comanches. I wasn't there when it mattered." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Can't change the past, friend. But you're here now. When this woman needs you, that counts for something." That night, they bedded down in the barn, Jack in the loft, Sarah in a clean stall Ruth had prepared with fresh straw and blankets. It was a far cry from the broken-down shack, and Jack felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Jack," Sarah's voice drifted up from below. "Yeah, thank you for everything. I know you didn't have to. Get some sleep. Sarah, tomorrow we start figuring out how to get you free of that contract." But sleep was elusive. Jack lay in the sweet-smelling hay, staring at the rafters and thinking about the road ahead. The wolf bounty would help, but it was dangerous work, and Henley wouldn't give up easily. Men like him never did. Somewhere in the night, an owl hooted, and further off, wolves howled at the moon. The sound sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He'd hunted men for years, but wolves were different, smarter in some ways, more primal in others, and this pack had already proven they could evade experienced hunters. He must have dozed because he woke to the sound of horses. Many horses, moving fast. Jack rolled to the loft window, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness. A group of riders was approaching from the south, and even in the dim light, he could see they were armed. "Sarah," he called softly. get up, quietly." She responded immediately, weeks of fear having taught her to wake alert. "What is it?" "Riders. Maybe nothing, but—" The lead rider's voice cut through the night. "Patterson, we know you're harboring fugitives. Send them out, and there won't be trouble." Jack recognized the voice. Tom Bassett, the rancher from the auction. So Henley had sent more than one group after them. Jacob appeared in the barn door, fully dressed and carrying his rifle. "What's the plan?" "No reason for you to get involved in this," Jack said. "It's our trouble. You're under my roof. That makes it my trouble too." Jacob's quiet certainty brooked no argument. "Besides, we don't hold with men who threaten peaceful folks." Ruth appeared with the children, herding them toward the root cellar. She pressed something into Sarah's hand. A small revolver. "Just in case," she said quietly. Jack checked his Colt, wishing again he had more ammunition. 5 shots against however many riders Bassett had brought. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. "Brennan," Bassett called again. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Mister, Henley just wants his property back." "I'm nobody's property," Sarah shouted back, surprising everyone with her vehemence. "Contract says different, woman. Now come out peaceful-like, or we'll come in and get you." Jack moved to the barn door, keeping to cover. "Any man sets foot on this property uninvited will regret it." Big talk for a man with no chips left to play. That's when Jack heard it, the distinctive sound of a Henry rifle being cocked. Moses Washington stepped out of the shadows near the chicken coop, and he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, all armed. "Funny thing about chips," Moses called out conversationally. "Sometimes friends loan you a few extra." The odds had shifted. Bassett had maybe 6 men, with Moses and his companions, plus Jacob. They were nearly even, and defending was always easier than attacking. Bassett must have come to the same conclusion. "This ain't over," he shouted. "That contract's legal, and the law's on our side." "Then use the law," Jacob called back. "But you'll not break the peace of my home." There was a long moment of tension. Then Bassett wheeled his horse around. "Fall back, boys. We'll settle this proper in town." As the riders disappeared into the growing dawn light, Sarah sagged against the barn wall. "They won't give up. Will they?" "No," Jack admitted. "But we bought some time." Moses approached, his weathered face serious. "That offer about the wolves still stands. But after this, I'm thinking you might need more than just money. You need allies." "What kind of allies?" "The kind that know the mountains like their own backyard. The kind that have their own reasons for disliking men like Henley." Moses glanced meaningfully toward the mountains. "The Apache aren't the only ones who've been pushed off their land by bankers and their hired guns." Jack understood. There was a community of outcasts in these hills, former slaves, displaced Indians, Mexicans who'd lost their grants, Chinese miners run out of town, people who'd learned to survive on the margins. "It's dangerous," he said, looking at Sarah. "Everything's dangerous now," she replied, steel in her voice again. "At least this offers a chance at real freedom." The sun was fully up now, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. Somewhere in those mountains, wolves howled, as if calling them to a reckoning. Jack thought about the strange turns that had brought them here, from a shameful auction to this moment of possibility. "All right," he said finally. "We'll take your help, and I'll hunt your wolves." Moses smiled. "Then we'd best get started. Those wolves won't hunt themselves, and Henley won't wait forever to make his next move." As they prepared to leave the Patterson homestead, Ruth pressed a package of food into Sarah's hands. "You take care of each other," she said. "The frontier's hard enough without facing it alone." Jack helped Sarah onto his horse. She'd finally agreed to ride, and looked back at the peaceful homestead one more time. They were leaving safety for uncertainty, trading shelter for the dangerous freedom of the mountains. But as they rode north with Moses and his men, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. A new life, perhaps. A chance to right old wrongs. The wolves were waiting in those mountains, along with dangers he couldn't yet imagine. But so was freedom. Real freedom. Not just words on a paper. And maybe, just maybe, something else was waiting too. Something that had been growing between him and Sarah since that moment on the auction block. The trail ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in 20 years, Jack Brennan was riding toward something instead of away from it. The attack came at dusk on their third day in the mountains. They'd been tracking the wolf pack through narrow canyons and along ridge lines, following signs that Moses read like scripture: a tuft of fur on thorn bush, claw marks on aspen bark, the remains of a deer cached beneath pine needles. Jack heard it first, the subtle change in the forest's rhythm that meant danger. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her behind a boulder just as the first rifle shot split the air. Rock chips exploded where she'd been standing. Down. He shouted, drawing his Colt as Moses and his two companions, a Mexican named Carlos and a former slave called Big Jim, scrambled for cover. More shots rang out, the echoes bouncing off canyon walls until it sounded like an army was firing. Jack counted muzzle flashes. At least 8 men, positioned on the ridge above them. They'd walked right into an ambush. "Brennan!" It was Bassett's voice, triumphant now. "Told you this wasn't over!" Sarah pressed close to the boulder. The small revolver Ruth had given her clutched in white-knuckled hands. A bullet whined overhead. Too close, and Jack pushed her lower. "Moses!" Jack called. "You hit?" "We're good," came the reply from behind a fallen log. "But they got us pinned neat as you please." Jack's mind raced. 5 guns against 8, and the enemy held the high ground. Their only advantage was the approaching darkness, but that was still minutes away. They needed to move before... Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her shoulder. Blood seeped between her fingers. "I'm shot," she said, voice small with shock. Rage flooded through Jack, hot and familiar. He'd kept it leashed for years, the killing fury that had made him such an effective bounty hunter. Now it broke free like a river through a dam. How bad? His hands were already tearing fabric, exposing the wound. The bullet had gouged a furrow across her shoulder, painful and bloody but not fatal if kept clean. "It burns," Sarah said through gritted teeth. Jack pulled off his bandana, pressing it against the wound. "Hold this tight." Then, louder, "Bassett, you just made the last mistake of your worthless life. Big talk, bounty man, you're outnumbered and outgunned." But Jack wasn't listening anymore. The cold calculation of the hunter had taken over. He'd noticed something Bassett's men hadn't, a narrow gulch running up the eastern side of their position, hidden by scrub oak. A man could climb it, if he didn't mind risking a fall. "Moses," he called. "Give me covering fire in 30 seconds. Everything you've got." "What are you planning?" Sarah grabbed his sleeve with her good hand. "What I do best," Jack said grimly. He reloaded his Colt, spun the cylinder. 5 shots plus 1 in the chamber. It would have to be enough. "Jack, don't..." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Hair wild, face dirt-streaked, blood on her dress, and still the strongest woman he'd ever known. "Stay alive," he said. "Whatever happens, you stay alive." Then he was moving, low and fast, using every rock and tree for cover. Behind him, Moses and the others opened fire, the bark of their rifles drowning out any sound he might make. Jack reached the gulch and started climbing, fingers finding holds in the crumbling rock. Halfway up, his boot slipped, sending a cascade of pebbles down. He pressed himself against the stone, heart hammering, but the gunfire covered the noise. Hand over hand, he climbed, the Colt, a comfortable weight on his hip. He reached the top behind Bassett's line. In the fading light, he could see them spread along the ridge, focused on the victims below. 8 men, like he'd counted, but spread out, confident in their advantage. Jack moved like a ghost, years of stalking outlaws serving him well. The first man never knew he was there until Jack's gun butt connected with his skull. The second turned at the sound of his partner falling, eyes widening in the split second before Jack's fist dropped him. "Johnson's down," someone shouted. "And Corb..." Jack shot the shouter, already moving before the man hit the ground. Another spin, another shot. The ambushers were scrambling now, trying to locate the threat among them.
Behind us! He's—
2 more shots in rapid succession. 3 bullets left, 3 men standing, including Bassett, who was backing away, his face pale in the twilight.
You son of a—
Jack shot the rifle from the man's hands, sending him stumbling backward. The last man besides Bassett threw down his gun, hands raised. "I'm out! I'm out!" That left Bassett, fumbling for his pistol. Jack closed the distance in 3 strides, knocking the gun away and driving his fist into the man's stomach. Bassett doubled over, gasping. "You shot her," Jack said, his voice deadly quiet. "You shot a woman. Henley's paying good money." Bassett wheezed. "Not enough." Jack hauled him upright by his shirt front. "You're going to call off this hunt. You're going to tell Henley that Sarah Morrison is under my protection, and anyone who comes after her will end up like your men here. You can't fight the law." "I'm not fighting the law. I'm fighting men who hide behind it." Jack released him with a shove. "Get out of here. Take your wounded and go. And if I see you again, I won't be so merciful." Bassett scrambled away, helped by the man who'd surrendered. They gathered their wounded, none dead. Jack had been careful about that, but several who wouldn't be riding anywhere for a while, and retreated into the gathering darkness. Jack made his way back down to the others. Sarah was sitting up, Moses wrapping her shoulder properly with strips torn from his spare shirt. She looked at Jack with eyes that held too many emotions to name. "You came back," she said. "Said I would. You could have killed them all." "Could have." Jack reloaded his Colt with bullets taken from the fallen weapons. "But dead men can't carry messages. Bassett will spread the word, come after us, and pay the price." Big Jim was collecting the abandoned rifles. "That was some shooting. Mr. Jack, where'd you learn to fight like that?" "Here and there." Jack didn't want to talk about the war, about the raids, about all the blood that had taught him his deadly skills. Carlos had built a small fire in a protected hollow. "We need to clean that wound proper. Senora, I have some mezcal. It will hurt, but prevent infection." Sarah nodded, biting down on a leather strip as Carlos poured the alcohol over her shoulder. She made no sound, but tears tracked down her cheeks. Jack wanted to hold her, to offer comfort, but held back. That wasn't his place, no matter what he might wish. They made camp there, posting watches through the night. Jack took the first watch, sitting where he could see both the approach trails and Sarah sleeping by the fire. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him tired and sore. He wasn't a young man anymore, and climbing that gulch had taken its toll. "Can't sleep." Moses settled beside him, producing a flask that he passed over. Jack took a sip. Good whiskey, smooth and warm, too keyed up. That was fine work today. Reminded me of stories I heard about a bounty hunter who took down the whole garrison gang single-handed. Stories grow in the telling. Maybe so. Moses was quiet for a moment. "That woman's got her hooks in you good." "It's not like that." "No, then why'd you go crazy when she got shot?" "I've seen men in battle. Jack, what you did up there wasn't tactics. It was personal." Jack had no answer for that. The fury he'd felt when he saw Sarah's blood still simmered under his skin. He'd thought that part of him was dead, buried with Mary and the children. But Sarah had awakened something, not just protective instincts, but something deeper. "She deserves better than a worn-out bounty hunter," he said finally. "Maybe so, but she deserves to make that choice herself." Moses stood, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "Get some rest. Carlos will take next watch." But Jack couldn't rest. He kept replaying the fight in his mind, seeing all the ways it could have gone wrong, if he'd been slower, if his aim had been off, if Sarah's wound had been worse. "You are thinking too loud." Sarah's voice came from the fireside. She was sitting up, cradling her injured arm. "You should be sleeping. So should you." She rose carefully and joined him on the rock. "Thank you for what you did. You got shot because of me, because I dragged you into this mess." "No." Her good hand found his in the darkness.
I got shot because evil men think they can own people. You're the one trying to stop them." Her hand was small in his, but warm. Jack found himself turning it over, tracing the calluses from hard work, feeling the strength in those delicate fingers. "When I saw you bleeding," he started, then stopped, not sure how to finish. "I know," Sarah said softly. "I saw your face. No one's ever... Daniel loved me. But it was a quiet love. Comfortable. What I saw in your eyes today was like wildfire. Sarah, I'm not asking for anything," she continued quickly. "I know this is complicated. I just wanted you to know that I saw, and I'm not afraid of it." They sat in silence as the fire burned low. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. The very pack they'd been hunting. The sound should have been ominous, but instead it seemed almost mournful, like a lament for all the wild things being pushed to the margins of the world. "We still have to deal with Henley," Jack said eventually. "This won't stop him. Then we keep fighting. We find those wolves, collect the bounty, hire a real lawyer, fight him with his own weapons. And if that doesn't work," Sarah's jaw set in that stubborn line he was coming to know well, "then we find another way. I won't go back to being property. Jack, I'll die first." "Won't come to that," Jack said firmly. "I promise you." She squeezed his hand. "Don't make promises you might not be able to keep. I've kept every promise I ever made. Couldn't keep Mary and the kids safe. But that wasn't a broken promise, just a failure." "This is different." "Why?" Jack thought about it. "Because I've got nothing left to lose except you. And I've already lost everything once. Won't happen again." Dawn was breaking by the time Carlos woke to take his watch. Sarah had dozed off against Jack's shoulder, and he'd spent the hours memorizing the feeling of her trust. When she stirred, he helped her back to her bedroll, checking the bandage on her shoulder. "The wolves are close," Moses said over a breakfast of jerky and hardtack. "All this gunfire will have spooked them some, but they'll circle back. This is their territory." "How's your shoulder?" Jack asked Sarah. "Sore, but I can ride." She proved it by swinging into the saddle with only a slight wince. They spent the day following wolf sign higher into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, the trails narrower. They were entering a landscape that seemed untouched by man-ancient pines reaching toward the sky. Meadows painted with late wildflowers, streams running cold and clear from hidden springs. "There," Big Jim pointed to a ridge across a narrow valley. "See them?" Jack squinted, then made out the shapes. A dozen wolves moving like gray shadows through the trees. Even at this distance, he could see they were magnificent creatures, nothing like the mangy coyotes that skulked around settlements. "The bounty's on their heads," Carlos said, checking his rifle. "But it seems a shame. No, they're just trying to live." "Same as us," Jack agreed, but they needed that money. Without it, they had no chance against Henley's legal manipulations. They spent the rest of the day maneuvering for position, trying to get within rifle range without spooking the pack. It was delicate work, requiring patience and skill. Sarah stayed close to Jack, her injured shoulder preventing her from handling a rifle, but her eyes sharp for movement. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, they finally had their chance. The pack was crossing a meadow, heading for their den. Jack steadied his borrowed rifle. One of the weapons Bassett's men had abandoned, and took aim at the lead wolf. His finger tightened on the trigger. The wolf paused, as if sensing danger, and looked directly at him. In that moment, Jack saw something that made him hesitate. Understanding, maybe, or recognition, one predator to another. The moment passed. The wolves melted back into the forest, and the opportunity was gone. "Why didn't you shoot?" Moses asked. Jack lowered the rifle. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll get them tomorrow." But as they made camp for the night, he wondered if that was true. The wolves were just trying to survive, same as him and Sarah. Did that make them enemies? Or kindred spirits? Sarah seemed to understand his mood. As they sat by the fire, she said quietly, "There's no shame in hesitating. It means you still have a soul. Soul doesn't put food on the table or lawyers in the courtroom. No,
But it's what separates us from men like Henley. She shifted, wincing at her shoulder. We'll find another way if we have to. The bounty is just money. We've made it this far without it. She looked at him, firelight dancing in her eyes. I'd rather be free and poor than bought with blood money. Jack thought about all the bounties he'd collected over the years, all the men he'd brought in for their 30 pieces of silver. Most had been bad men who deserved their fate, but some, like that young horse thief, had just been desperate souls trying to survive. All right, he said. We'll try it your way. See if we can find another solution. Sarah smiled then, a real smile that transformed her tired face. Thank you. Moses approached, having overheard. If you're not collecting the wolf bounty, I might have another idea. There's a man in the mountains, a hermit named Ezekiel. Used to be a judge before he gave up on civilization. He might know a legal way around that contract. Why would he help us? Because he hates men like Henley more than he hates people in general. Worth a try? Anyway. Jack looked at Sarah, who nodded. Let's find this hermit judge, she said. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, Jack thought, but as he watched her by the firelight, brave and determined despite everything, he knew he'd follow her plan. The wolves would live another day, and maybe, just maybe, they'd find justice without blood. The mountains held their secrets close, but somewhere in those peaks was a man who might hold the key to their freedom. It was a slim hope. But then again, their whole journey had been built on slim hopes. And sometimes, Jack reflected, that was enough. The sandstorm hit them just as they found shelter in the abandoned mining camp. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a wall of dust and grit came howling down from the mountains like the wrath of God himself. They barely had time to get the horses into the old equipment shed before the world disappeared in a brown shroud. Jack pulled Sarah into the most intact structure, what had once been the mine's office. Judging by the rusted safe in the corner and the remnants of a desk, the roof was half gone, patched with rusty sheets of corrugated tin that screamed and rattled in the wind like tortured souls. Get down, Jack shouted over the roar, pulling her to the floor as a piece of tin tore free and went spinning into the maelstrom. Sand poured through the gap, stinging exposed skin like 1,000 needles. They huddled against the wall, Jack's body shielding Sarah from the worst of it. Her injured shoulder pressed against his chest, and he could feel her trembling, whether from cold, fear, or something else. He couldn't tell. The storm raged on, turning day to twilight. The old building groaned and shuddered, threatening to come apart at the seams. Dust filled the air so thick they had to breathe through their shirts, and still it coated their throats and lungs. Moses and the others? Sarah shouted in his ear. They made it to the supply building. Jack had seen them dive for cover just before visibility went to 0. They'll be fine. Another piece of roofing tore away, and more sand cascaded down. The wind was a living thing, clawing at the walls, seeking any weakness. Jack had been through storms before, but this was something biblical, as if the desert itself was trying to scour them from existence. Sarah pressed closer, and he wrapped his arms around her, creating a small pocket of relative safety in the chaos. Her hair whipped around them, and he could taste the salt of tears mixing with the dust on her cheeks. I'm scared, she admitted, the words almost lost in the wind. Me too, Jack said, surprising himself with the honesty. But we'll get through this. How do you know? Because I'm too stubborn to die in a sandstorm, and you're too strong to let one beat you. She laughed, actually laughed, in the middle of that howling hell, and Jack felt something shift in his chest. 20 years of ice around his heart cracking like spring thaw. The storm seemed to last forever, but gradually, imperceptibly, it began to weaken. The roar diminished to a moan, then a whisper. The sand stopped flying horizontally and began to settle, covering everything in a fine brown layer. They stayed pressed together even after the danger passed, neither willing to break the contact. Jack became aware of things he'd been too panicked to notice before. The way Sarah fit against him, the scent of her hair beneath the dust, the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. Sarah, he began, not sure what he wanted to say. "I know," she whispered, then lifting her face to his. "I know, Jack." He kissed her then, there in that ruined building with dust still settling around them. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, full of all the loneliness and loss they'd both carried for so long. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her good hand tangled in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. We shouldn't." "Why not?" Jack's voice was rough. "Because of that damn contract? Because of what people think? Because I'm not free to give myself to anyone. Not yet." She touched his face gently. "And you deserve someone who can come to you clean, without legal chains." "I don't care about clean. I care about you." "I know." She kissed him again, softly this time. "That's why we have to wait. When I come to you, if I come to you, it'll be as a free woman. I claim you straight after Jack Brennan, but not before I can do it right." Jack understood, though every fiber of his being rebelled against it. She needed to own herself before she could give herself. It was a matter of dignity, of choice, of all the things that had been stripped from her. "I'll wait," he said. "Long as it takes." They emerged from the building to find a world transformed. The storm had scoured away landmarks, filled in trails, turned the familiar landscape alien. Moses and the others were digging out the horses, all accounted for but spooked and sand-caked. "Everyone all right?" Moses called, then stopped, looking at Jack and Sarah with knowing eyes. Something had changed between them, visible as lightning-struck trees. "We're good," Jack said, helping Sarah navigate the new drifts. "How far to this hermit, Judge?" "Half a day, if the trail's still there." Moses pointed toward the higher peaks. "Storm might have done us a favor, actually. Anybody following us will have lost our tracks." They spent the morning digging out and moving on, climbing higher into country that seemed untouched by man. The abandoned mine had been the last sign of civilization. Now they moved through primeval forest, following game trails and Moses's memory. Sarah rode beside Jack, their knees occasionally touching. They didn't speak of what had happened during the storm, but it hung between them like a promise. Every glance, every accidental contact, carried new weight. "There," Moses said finally, pointing to a barely visible structure nestled between two peaks. Ezekiel's place. It was less a cabin than a fortress built into the mountainside. Stone walls merged with natural rock, and what windows existed were narrow slits. Smoke rose from a chimney that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. "Friendly sort," Carlos muttered. They approached carefully, Moses calling out when they were still 50 yards away. "Ezekiel, it's Moses Washington. I brought people who need your help." For a long moment, nothing. Then a voice like grinding stone. "Moses, should have known you'd disturb my peace eventually. Come ahead, but slowly, and keep your hands visible." The door opened as they dismounted, revealing a man who looked like an Old Testament prophet, wild white hair and beard, eyes sharp as broken glass, wearing what might have once been judge's robes but now looked more like hermit's rags. "Judge Ezekiel Stone," Moses said formally. "These folks need your legal expertise." Stone's eyes fixed on Sarah, then Jack, reading their story in an instant. The Dust Creek auction. Heard about that abomination even up here. He spat. Silas Henley's work, unless I miss my guess. "You know him?" Sarah asked. "Know him? I sent him to prison once, back when I believed in justice. He got out on technicalities and bribes, came west to practice his evil where the law's thinner." Stone stepped aside. "Come in, tell me everything." The interior was a strange mix of wilderness dwelling and law library. Books lined rough-hewn shelves, and legal documents covered a massive table made from a single slab of pine. A pot of something that might generously be called stew bubbled over the fire. They told their story while Stone listened, occasionally asking sharp questions. When Jack produced the contract, Stone studied it with the intensity of a man reading scripture. "Clever," he finally said. "Henley always was too clever. This contract is technically legal, binding under territorial law." Sarah's shoulders sagged. "Then there's no hope?" "I didn't say that." Stone's smile was sharp as a blade. "Legal and enforceable are two different things, and there are older laws than what Henley's counting on." He pulled down a massive leather-bound volume, pages yellow with age. Contract law, even here, is based on certain principles, one being that a contract signed under duress is voidable. But I signed as guarantor on Daniel's loans voluntarily. Sarah said, "The loans, yes, but this indenture contract, you signed that under threat of immediate harm? Did you not? At a public auction where you were being sold?" "Yes, but—" "And you, Mr. Brennan, you signed under similar duress, the moral imperative to prevent a grave injustice." Jack nodded slowly. "You could say that. Then the contract fails the basic test of voluntary consent." Stone was warming to his subject now, the old legal fire burning bright. "Furthermore, there's the question of consideration. What did Mrs. Morrison receive in exchange for 7 years of labor? Freedom from the auction." Jack said, "But freedom from an illegal condition. It's like paying someone not to commit a crime against you. The courts call that extortion, not contract." Stone spent the next hour building his case, citing precedents and principles with the passion of a man who'd found his calling. Sarah and Jack exchanged glances. Was this really possible? "There's just one problem," Stone said finally. "This needs to be argued before a judge who'll listen, and Judge Pritchard in Dust Creek is in Henley's pocket." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked. "Circuit judge comes through in 2 weeks. Judge Franklin Howard, honest man, can't be bought. File the case with him, and Henley's whole scheme falls apart." Stone began writing rapidly. "I'll prepare the documents, but you'll need to stay alive until then." "Henley won't wait," Jack said. "He'll send more men." "Then you'd best be ready." Stone looked up from his writing. "There's an old line cabin about 10 miles north. Defensible position, good sight lines. Hole up there until the circuit judge arrives." They spent the night with Stone, listening to his stories of the old days when he'd believed law could bring justice. The storm had blown itself out, leaving crystal-clear skies brilliant with stars. Jack found Sarah standing outside, gazing at the heavens. "Penny for your thoughts? Just thinking how small our troubles seem under all that sky." She leaned against him slightly. "Do you think Stone's plan will work? It's the best chance we've had, and if it doesn't—" Jack was quiet for a moment. "Then we run. Mexico, maybe somewhere Henley can't reach. A life on the run. A life," Jack emphasized. "Together, if you'll have me." Sarah turned to face him, starlight reflecting in her eyes. "I claimed you in that storm. Jack Brennan, didn't you hear me?" "I heard, just making sure you haven't come to your senses." She stood on her toes and kissed him softly. "My senses are fine. It's my heart that's gone completely mad." They held each other there under the vast Nevada sky. Two damaged souls who'd found something worth fighting for. The legal battle ahead would be dangerous, but they'd face it together. "I love you," Jack said, the words rusty from disuse but true as sunrise. "I love you too." Sarah replied, "And when this is over, when I'm truly free, I'll show you just how much—" Moses's cough interrupted them. "Hate to break up the moment, but we've got riders coming. Looks like Henley got impatient." Jack counted lights moving up the mountain torches, at least a dozen. "How long until they reach us?" "Hour, maybe less." Stone appeared in his doorway. "Then you'd best take these papers and ride. I'll delay them." "They'll hurt you," Sarah protested. The old judge smiled grimly. "Let them try. I've got a few surprises for anyone who disturbs my peace." He handed Sarah a sealed packet. "Everything you need is there. File it with Judge Howard, and you're free." They saddled quickly, the sound of approaching horses growing louder, as they prepared to ride out. Stone called to Jack. "Take care of her, bounty man. She's worth more than all the gold Henley ever stole. I know, Jack said. I'll guard her with my life. Guard her with your heart, Stone corrected. That's what she really needs. They rode into the darkness, leaving the hermit judge to face whatever came. Behind them, they could hear Stone's booming voice. Private property, gentlemen, and I'm well within my rights to defend it. The sound of gunfire followed them into the night, but Jack didn't look back. They had what they'd come for. Hope in the form of legal documents. Now they just had to survive long enough to use them. The line cabin was where Stone had promised, built solid and defensible. As they approached, the first light of dawn was touching the peaks. They were exhausted, sand-scoured, pursued, but not defeated. 2 weeks, Sarah said as they dismounted. We just have to last 2 weeks. We'll last, Jack promised. And then you'll be free, and then I'll be yours, she corrected. By choice, not contract, the way it should be. They entered the cabin together, ready to make their stand. The storm had passed, but the fight for freedom was just beginning, and Jack knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this was a fight they'd win, not because they were stronger or better armed than their enemies, but because they had something worth fighting for, each other, and the future they'd claim once the chains were finally broken. The morning they returned to Dust Creek, the town seemed to hold its breath. Word had already spread. Jack Brennan and the widow were coming back, and they were coming back fighting. The main street, usually busy with morning commerce, was nearly empty except for a few brave souls who watched from doorways and windows. Jack rode in front, his hand never far from his gun. Sarah rode beside him, back straight and chin high, wearing a new dress they'd bought with money Moses had loaned them. The legal documents from Judge Stone were tucked safe in Jack's saddlebags, their ticket to freedom if they could just file them with the circuit judge. Behind them rode Moses, Big Jim, Carlos, and 3 other men who'd joined their cause, outcasts and drifters who'd found common purpose in standing against Henley's tyranny. They made an odd procession, but a determined one. There, Sarah pointed to the courthouse at the end of the street. Judge Pritchard will be there, along with Henley and God knows who else. Jack muttered. Sure enough, he could see men positioned on rooftops, trying to look casual and failing. They tied their horses outside the courthouse. The building was newer than most in Dust Creek, built with territorial money in an attempt to bring civilization to the frontier. It hadn't worked. Civilization required more than buildings. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Henley sat in the front row like a spider in his web, surrounded by hired guns trying to pass as concerned citizens. Judge Pritchard presided from the bench, his weak chin and watery eyes marking him as a man who bent with every wind. Mr. Brennan. Pritchard's voice squeaked slightly. I understand you have business with the court? Jack stepped forward. Sarah beside him. We're here to file papers challenging the validity of Mrs. Morrison's indenture contract. Henley was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. The contract was signed and witnessed. It's perfectly legal. Legal documents can be challenged, Jack said evenly. That's what courts are for. Or have you forgotten that in your rush to own human beings? A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of Dust Creek's citizens had come to watch, and not all of them were in Henley's pocket. Jack saw Ruth Patterson near the back, and Reverend Mills, and others who'd shown kindness. Let me see these papers, Pritchard said reluctantly. Jack handed over Stone's carefully prepared documents. Pritchard's face grew paler as he read. This is highly irregular. These precedents, Judge Stone has no standing here anymore. The law has standing. Sarah spoke up, her voice clear and strong. Or doesn't that matter in Dust Creek? How dare you, Henley snarled. You owe me $800. Woman, that debt doesn't disappear because some mountain hermit wrote fancy words. The debt was my husband's, Sarah said. I never benefited from those loans. I never saw a penny of that money. Yet I'm the one being sold. More murmurs from the crowd. Jack saw doubt creeping into some faces that had been certain before. Pritchard banged his gavel weakly. Order. This is not the proper venue for such arguments. When the circuit judge arrives— The circuit judge isn't coming, Henley interrupted smoothly. Received word yesterday. Judge Howard was delayed by Indian troubles. Won't be here for months, if at all. Jack felt Sarah sag beside him. This had been Henley's plan all along. Make sure the circuit judge never arrived, leaving them at Pritchard's dubious mercy. However, Henley continued, smiling like a rattlesnake. I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Morrison. I'll make you a new offer. Come work for me voluntarily, just 3 years instead of 7, and I'll forgive the entire debt. Work for you, Sarah said flatly. In my household. As a companion. I'm a lonely man, after all. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Jack's hand moved to his gun, but Sarah caught his wrist. No, she said simply. I'd rather hang. That can be arranged too, Henley snapped, his composure cracking. Pritchard, I want her arrested for breach of contract. The judge hesitated. Even he could feel the mood in the room shifting. Now, Silas, perhaps we should— Do it! Before Pritchard could respond, the courtroom doors burst open. A woman strode in, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive traveling dress and an expression that could freeze flame. Behind her came 2 men in city suits carrying briefcases. I hope I'm not interrupting, the woman said in a voice that suggested she didn't care if she was— I'm looking for my son's widow. Sarah Morrison? Sarah gasped. Mrs. Morrison? Daniel's mother? The older woman's stern expression softened slightly as she looked at Sarah. My dear girl, I came as soon as I received your letter. She turned to face Henley, and her expression hardened again. And you must be the vulture who's been preying on my daughter-in-law. Madam, I don't know who you are, but I am Elizabeth Morrison of the Boston Morrisons. My late husband was James Morrison, who built half the railroads in New England. My son may have been a dreamer and a fool, but he was my son. She gestured to her companions. These gentlemen are Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Chase from Hartwell. Chase and Associates. Perhaps you've heard of them? Henley had gone pale. Everyone had heard of Hartwell and Chase. They were the legal firm that had broken up the Copper Trust, that had sent millionaires to prison. Now then, Elizabeth continued, I understand there's some question of debt. Mr. Hartwell? The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Our clients are prepared to pay any legitimate debts incurred by the late Daniel Morrison. However, he looked at Henley over his spectacles. We will require a full accounting, every penny, properly documented, and of course, any interest rates exceeding the legal maximum of 8% per annum will be considered usurious and void. 20%, Jack said helpfully. He was charging 20%. Dear me, Hartwell said mildly. That's quite illegal. In fact, that voids the entire debt and opens Mr. Henley to criminal charges. Shall I continue? Henley looked like he'd swallowed a rattlesnake. This is my town. You can't come in here and— Actually, the second lawyer, Chase, spoke up. We've already spoken with the territorial governor. He's very interested in reports of debt slavery and judicial corruption. I believe federal marshals are on their way. The courtroom erupted. Henley's hired guns looked uncertain. Fighting locals was one thing, but federal marshals were another matter entirely. Some began edging toward the doors. Furthermore, Elizabeth Morrison said, raising her voice over the chaos, I've purchased the Pioneer Bank of Dust Creek as of this morning. Mr. Henley, you're fired. Please vacate the premises immediately. You can't do this, Henley screamed, his face purple with rage. It's done. She turned to Sarah. My dear, I apologize for taking so long to arrive. When I received your letter about Daniel's death and your circumstances, I was devastated. I should have come sooner. I didn't think the letter would reach you, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Mothers always know when their children need them, even mothers-in-law. Elizabeth's eyes moved to Jack, assessing. And you must be Mr. Brennan. Sarah wrote of your kindness. Jack felt suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. "Ma'am." "Don't ma'am me, young man. You saved my daughter-in-law when her own family failed her. That makes you family in my book." Henley made one last desperate play. "Pritchard, order, make them stop." But Judge Pritchard had read the wind. "Court is adjourned," he squeaked, fleeing the bench like it was on fire. That's when Henley pulled his gun. Jack moved without thinking, shoving Sarah behind him as Henley's first shot splintered the wooden rail beside them. His own Colt was in his hand, the weight familiar as breathing. Time slowed to molasses. Henley's second shot went wide as Moses tackled him from the side. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the gun skittering across the floor. Henley scrambled for it, desperation making him fast, but Jack was faster. One shot, clean and center. Henley looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, surprise replacing rage on his face. This is my town." "Not anymore," Jack said quietly. Henley fell forward and didn't get up again. The courtroom was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in chaos again, but different this time. Some of Henley's men were being subdued by townspeople who'd found their courage. Others were fleeing. Reverend Mills was already kneeling beside Henley, praying for a soul that was probably past saving. "Are you all right?" Jack asked Sarah, his hands checking her for injuries. "I'm fine." She was staring at Elizabeth Morrison like she was seeing a ghost. "I can't believe you came." "Of course I came." The older woman's composure never cracked, even with a dead man on the courtroom floor. "You're the only family I have left. Daniel is gone, but you remain, if you'll have me." Sarah flew into her mother-in-law's arms, sobbing. Jack stepped back, giving them space, and found Moses beside him. "Well," Moses said, "that's not how I expected this to go." "Me neither." Jack was still holding his gun. He realized. He holstered it slowly. "Is it over? The legal part? Seems like—" Moses grinned. "The rest? Brother, I think that's just beginning." He was right. Over the next hours, Dust Creek transformed. With Henley dead and his power broken, people found their voices. Stories came out, other debts, other pressures, other corruptions. The federal marshals arrived by evening to find half their work done for them. Elizabeth Morrison took charge with the efficiency of a woman who'd run businesses and charities for 40 years. The bank's books revealed Henley's web of exploitation, and she set about untangling it with ruthless precision. "Debts forgiven," she announced from the bank's steps. "All of them. We're starting fresh." The cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next territory. That night, they gathered in the hotel dining room. Jack, Sarah, Elizabeth, Moses and his companions, the Pattersons, Reverend Mills, and others. It was the first time many of them had sat at the same table, social barriers breaking down in the face of shared victory. "I owe you all more than I can say," Sarah said, raising a glass of the hotel's best wine, which wasn't very good, but nobody cared. "You risked everything for a stranger." "You weren't a stranger," Ruth Patterson said firmly. "You were a woman in need. That made you our responsibility." "Still," Elizabeth said, "such kindness should be rewarded." "I understand there was a bounty on some wolves?" Jack started to protest that it wasn't necessary, but Moses kicked him under the table. "Yes, ma'am, $20 a head. Consider it paid, for all of them, whether they were hunted or not." She smiled at their shocked faces. "Wolves have a right to live too, perhaps more than some humans I could name." Later, Jack found himself on the hotel's porch, watching the stars. The town was quiet now, but it was a different quiet than before, peaceful rather than fearful. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It's over. The contract's void. You're free." "Yes." She turned to face him. "Which means I can finally say this properly. Jack Brennan, I love you. I choose you. Not because I have to, not because you saved me, but because you're the best man I've ever known." Jack's throat was tight. "Sarah, Shh." She put a finger to his lips. "I know you love me. You've shown it 100 ways. Now I can show you 2. She kissed him then, there on the porch with the whole town as witness if they cared to look. It was a kiss full of promise, of tomorrows they'd almost lost, of freedom finally claimed. "Marry me," Jack said when they broke apart. "Tomorrow, next week, whenever you want. But marry me." "Yes." No hesitation. No doubt. "Yes, Jack." Elizabeth Morrison appeared in the doorway, trying and failing to hide a smile. "I suppose I should ask your intentions toward my daughter-in-law, Mr. Brennan." "The most honorable, ma'am." "Good, because I've decided to stay in Dust Creek for a while. This town needs rebuilding, and I find I need a project." She looked at Sarah. "I thought perhaps we could turn that awful auction platform into something useful. A school, perhaps. Every child deserves education, regardless of their circumstances." Sarah's eyes shone. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Then it settled. Elizabeth swept back inside, already making plans. Jack and Sarah stood together in the starlight, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. They'd won against all odds, found justice in an unjust world, and discovered love in the most unlikely circumstances. "What now?" Sarah asked. "Now?" Jack pulled her close. "Now we live. We build something good here. We prove that right can triumph over might, at least sometimes. Together, always together." The moon rose over Dust Creek, illuminating a town reborn. On the main street, the auction platform stood empty, waiting to be transformed. Like the town, like Jack and Sarah themselves, it would become something better, something that honored struggle and celebrated freedom. Justice had come to Dust Creek at last, not wearing a badge or carrying a gavel, but in the form of ordinary people who'd decided that enough was enough. And at the heart of it, two broken souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. The end was really just the beginning. Spring came early to Dust Creek that year, as if nature itself was eager to wash away the bitter memories of winter. The snow melted from the mountains in rushing streams, and the desert bloomed with a carpet of wildflowers that old-timers said they'd never seen the like of. Jack stood on the porch of their new home, watching Sarah tend the gardens she'd planted beside the creek. They'd built the small house with their own hands, with help from Moses and the others, on land Elizabeth Morrison had purchased at the edge of town. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. "Coffee's ready," Sarah called, straightening up and brushing dirt from her hands. She wore a simple calico dress and had her hair tied back, but to Jack she looked more beautiful than any society lady in silks and jewels. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. It had been 6 months since the confrontation in the courthouse, 6 months since their wedding in Reverend Mill's small church. The ceremony had been simple, but the whole town had turned out to celebrate, a far cry from the hostility they'd faced that first day. "Elizabeth wants us to come for dinner tonight," Sarah said, sipping her coffee. "She's got news from Boston." Jack nodded. His mother-in-law had become a force of nature in Dust Creek, transforming the struggling town into something approaching prosperity. The auction platform was gone now, replaced by a neat schoolhouse where Sarah taught 3 days a week. The bank operated on fair terms, helping ranchers and miners build businesses instead of bleeding them dry. Moses stopped by earlier. Jack said, "There's been Apache raids north of here, armies asking for scouts who know the territory." Sarah's hand found his. "Are you thinking of going? Not scouting, but maybe helping negotiate. Moses knows some of the Apache leaders. They're not raiders by choice. They're starving, pushed off their hunting grounds." It was the kind of work that mattered. Jack had discovered, not hunting men for bounties, but finding ways for people to live together. He'd done several such jobs over the winter, earning respect from both sides. "I think you should," Sarah said. "It's what you're good at, seeing past the surface to what's really happening." "What I'm good at is loving you," Jack said, pulling her close. "That too." She laughed, the sound like music. They were interrupted by the sound of horses. 3 riders approached. Moses, Big Jim, and surprisingly, Judge Stone, looking healthier than when they'd last seen him. Ezekiel, Sarah called out. What brings you down from your mountain? The old judge dismounted with a groan. Spring cleaning. Decided my hermit days are over. Thought I might set up practice here, if the town will have me. Dust Creek could use an honest judge, Jack said, shaking the man's hand. Well, I don't know about honest, but I'm too old to be bought. Stone's eyes twinkled. Besides, I hear there's a new hotel restaurant that serves actual edible food. A man gets tired of his own cooking. They talked for a while about the changes in town, the plans for the future. Big Jim had started a freight company with the money Elizabeth had paid for the wolf bounty. Carlos had gone back to Mexico but sent letters promising to return with his family. The town was growing, changing, becoming something new. As the visitors prepared to leave, Moses pulled Jack aside. That Apache situation, it's serious. They trust you. Jack, your word carries weight since you treated them fair last winter. I'll ride out tomorrow, Jack promised. We'll ride out, Sarah corrected. Having overheard, I'm coming with you. Jack started to protest, then saw the look in her eyes. She'd earned the right to make her own choices, and he'd learned not to underestimate her strength. That evening, dinner at Elizabeth Morrison's grand house. She'd bought and renovated Henley's former mansion, turning it into something warm and welcoming. Was a lively affair. Ruth and Jacob Patterson were there with their children, Reverend Mills and his wife, and several of the town's new merchants. I've had word from Boston, Elizabeth announced over dessert. Several families are interested in relocating here. Good families, looking for fresh starts. They'll need homes, businesses, lives. We'll need to expand the school, Sarah said. Already planning. And improve the roads, Jacob added. Can't have commerce without decent roads. Jack listened to them plan and dream, marveling at the transformation. This time last year, Dust Creek had been dying, poisoned by greed and cruelty. Now it hummed with possibility. After dinner, he and Sarah walked home under a canopy of stars. The desert air was sweet with sage and the promise of rain. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs, and somewhere a nighthawk called. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked suddenly. Spending your last coins that day. Jack stopped walking, turning to face her. Best investment I ever made. Even though it cost you everything, it gave me everything. He touched her face gently. You gave me everything. They stood there in the starlight, remembering that day at the auction, the fear and desperation, the moment when Jack had made his choice. So much had changed since then, but the core of it remained. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. The next morning, they rode out toward the mountains, where the Apache waited. Jack wore his guns, but hoped he wouldn't need them. Sarah carried medical supplies and food, practical gifts that spoke louder than words. The meeting place was a box canyon with good water and shelter. The Apache band was smaller than Jack had expected. Maybe 30 people, mostly women and children. Their leader, a man named Naichi, greeted Jack with cautious respect. You are the one who spoke truth last winter, Naichi said in accented English. Who kept the soldiers from attacking our winter camp. This is my wife, Sarah. We've come to talk, to find a way forward that doesn't end in blood. The negotiations took 3 days. 3 days of careful words, of building trust, of finding common ground. Sarah won the Apache women over by treating sick children and sharing food. Jack spent hours with Naichi and the other men, mapping out territories, discussing hunting rights, finding compromises. In the end, they reached an agreement. The Apache would cease raiding in exchange for designated hunting grounds and monthly food supplies until they could re-establish their traditional ways. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. You are different from the others, Naichi told Jack as they prepared to leave. You see us as people, not savages. We're all just trying to survive. Jack replied. Some of us have just been luckier than others. Naichi nodded slowly. Your woman. She has a warrior's heart. You are fortunate. I know, Jack said. watching Sarah say goodbye to the Apache children. "Believe me, I know." They rode back to Dust Creek through a landscape transformed by spring rain. The arroyos ran with water, and flowers carpeted the desert floor. It was as if the land itself was celebrating renewal, washing away the old hurts and making space for new growth. "I'm proud of you," Sarah said as they crested the last ridge before town. "You've found your purpose again." "We've found it," Jack corrected. "None of this would have happened without you." "Without us," she said firmly. "That's the lesson, isn't it? We're stronger together than alone." Dust Creek spread before them in the afternoon light, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of construction ringing from the new buildings going up. Children played in the streets, Apache, Mexican, black, and white together, attending Sarah's integrated school that had caused such controversy at first but now seemed natural as breathing. They reined in their horses for a moment, taking in the scene. It wasn't perfect. No place ever was, but it was good. It was home. "Look," Sarah pointed to the site where the auction platform had stood. The schoolhouse was painted white with blue trim, and someone had planted roses around the entrance. "Beauty from ashes." "Like us," Jack said. "Like us." She agreed. They rode down into town together, welcomed by waves and called greetings. At the hotel, Elizabeth Morrison waited on the porch, her austere face breaking into a smile at the sight of them. "How did it go?" she asked. "Peace," Sarah reported. "At least for now." "For now is all any of us have," Elizabeth said philosophically. "Come, tell me everything. I've had letters from 3 more families wanting to relocate here. We'll need more houses, more businesses." Jack listened to the women plan, feeling a contentment he'd thought lost forever. In the distance, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere out there, wolves still roamed free. The Apache made camp by clear streams, and the desert kept its ancient secrets. But here in Dust Creek, life went on. People built and planned and dreamed. Children learned. Crops grew. Love flourished. It wasn't the ending of a story so much as the beginning of 1,000 new ones. Sarah took his hand, squeezing gently. "No regrets?" "None," Jack said, and meant it. Not a single one. As night fell over the town, lamps were lit in windows, casting warm light into the darkness. In the hotel dining room, friends gathered to share meals and stories. At the edge of town, in a small house by the creek, a former bounty hunter and a widowed woman made their own light, their own story, their own future. The auction that had brought them together seemed like something from another lifetime now. But they both remembered the moment when Jack had spent his last coins, when Sarah had been saved from a fate worse than debt, when 2 broken people had taken the first step toward wholeness. It hadn't been easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But standing there in the lamplight, watching Sarah move about their home with grace and purpose, Jack knew he'd do it all again. Every hardship, every danger, every uncertain moment, they'd all led here, to this life they'd built together. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, wild and free. Jack smiled, remembering how he'd almost hunted them for bounty. Now they were neighbors, fellow survivors in a harsh land that demanded strength but rewarded courage. "Coming to bed?" Sarah called from the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light within. "Coming," Jack said, taking one last look at the stars before following her inside. The door closed on the night, on the past, on all the might-have-beens. Inside was warmth and love and the promise of tomorrow. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. I hope Jack and Sarah's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Where are you listening from today? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of courage, love, and redemption from the American frontier. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What part resonated with you the most? Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the sunset.